The encounter. The night air was cool and crisp as a black, gleaming Rolls-Royce coasted through the city streets. The car seemed to glide like an elegant predator through the quiet urban landscape. At the wheel sat Danielle Carter, her dark brown skin glowing beneath the streetlights, a striking contrast against the sleek red gown she wore. She was a woman of rare confidence, but beneath that outward poise lay the unwavering determination of an undercover FBI agent working on a high-stakes case that had kept her on edge for weeks. Danielle had learned long ago how to blend in with her surroundings. People rarely took notice of her, dismissing her as just another woman in an expensive car. But tonight was different. It was one of those rare moments where she had to take a break, a moment for herself away from the intensity of the investigation. She had been working undercover for months, tracking a notorious crime syndicate that had its hands in a variety of illicit activities. But tonight, the car ride was supposed to be just that. Nothing more. As she turned onto a quieter street, her mind was racing with thoughts of the case. She had only a few more leads to follow. And soon, she'd have enough evidence to bring down the operation. But as fate would have it, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of police lights in her rearview mirror. Danielle's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. A chill ran through her, but she quickly masked it. She pulled over to the side of the road, as calm as ever. It wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over, but tonight felt different. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The officer who approached her car was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of arrogance that didn't sit well with her. His eyes were cold as they scanned her car, quickly dismissing her with a sneer. He didn't introduce himself or offer any kind of explanation for the stop. Instead, he immediately demanded, "Whose car is this?" Danielle felt a familiar surge of irritation. "It's mine," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tension creeping up her spine. The officer chuckled in a manner that made her blood boil. "A Rolls-Royce. Yours? Don't lie to me." Danielle's jaw tightened, but she refused to let him get under her skin. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice measured and calm. "This car is mine." The officer's suspicions seemed to grow, his tone becoming more aggressive. "License and registration." Without a word, Danielle reached into her purse, her movements deliberate. She retrieved her documents and handed them over, but the officer snatched them out of her hand as though she were some criminal. He barely glanced at the information before muttering under his breath, "We'll see about this." Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Danielle's mind was sharp, aware of every shift in the officer's demeanor. It didn't take long for the officer to accuse her of stealing the car. "You don't own this. Who did you steal it from?" he demanded, his voice laced with scorn. The accusation stung, but Danielle held her ground. "I've complied with your requests. If there's an issue, I'd like to know what it is." The officer's frustration only seemed to grow as his eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Step out of the car," he barked. Danielle knew the situation had escalated far beyond reason. Her instincts screamed that this was no ordinary stop. As she slowly stepped out of the vehicle, her red gown shimmered in the dim light, adding to the surreal nature of the moment. She knew what was at stake now. The officer began rifling through her car without consent, as if searching for something to justify his actions. Danielle's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to lose her composure. She watched as he searched her belongings with growing frustration. Finally, his face twisted with anger. "You're under investigation for grand theft auto," he declared, the accusation falling from his lips like a hammer. Danielle's eyes flashed with fury, but she remained calm. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice steady but full of warning. Her hand reached into her purse once more. The officer's eyes widened as he saw her pull out a badge, the gleaming symbol of authority that would change everything. "I am Special Agent Danielle Carter," she said, her voice unwavering. "With the FBI." The officer's face drained of color as he processed her words. The shock was palpable, but Danielle didn't wait for him to recover. She had already started recording the incident on her phone. documenting everything. You've violated my rights, and you've conducted yourself in a manner unbecoming of an officer of the law," she continued, her tone commanding. The officer stood frozen, unable to comprehend the gravity of his mistake. His mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to find the right words, but none came. The apology he muttered was too little, too late. Danielle's voice cut through the awkward silence. "This is about more than me. This is about the countless people who face this kind of treatment every single day, simply because of the color of their skin." She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The fallout. Uncovering the truth. The day after the confrontation, Agent Danielle Carter woke up to the weight of what had happened. What had started as a simple, unassuming interaction had quickly spiraled into a moment that not only challenged her but threatened to expose the ugliness of systemic issues within law enforcement. She knew that this wasn't just about her or the officer. This was about a much larger issue, an issue that many people faced every day, particularly in marginalized communities. Racism was an ugly truth, and she had just unintentionally exposed a crack in the system. Despite the officer's insistent and humiliating accusations, Danielle had kept her cool. It wasn't easy, but now, the hard part was just beginning. She wasn't one to back down, and the thought of letting the incident go was not something that could sit well with her conscience. She was an FBI agent. She had spent years working on cases that required attention to detail, patience, and a relentless pursuit of justice. The badge she carried meant far more than just authority. It symbolized a moral obligation to right the wrongs, to challenge inequality, and to call out abuses of power when they happened. The first step was filing the complaint, which Danielle did with unwavering resolve. She gathered every bit of evidence she could, from her body cam footage to the phone call she had recorded, where the officer's actions were clearly documented. Every word, every moment had to be accounted for. Danielle had been an agent long enough to know that the devil was in the details. She wasn't simply documenting an embarrassing incident for the officer. She was shining a light on a pervasive issue. This was a systemic problem that needed to be confronted head-on. She spent hours typing out her complaint, laying out the officer's actions and the way he had harassed and belittled her without reason. She was careful, methodical, and precise. It wasn't just about this particular officer. It was about the broader implications of what his behavior represented. How many times had others been unjustly targeted because of their race, their status, or their appearance? How many others had been humiliated, had their dignity stripped away, simply because they were deemed out of place by people in power? Once the complaint was filed, it didn't take long for the story to get out. The news outlets picked up the story, and what had initially seemed like a small personal conflict began to snowball into something larger. Social media erupted in conversation, and opinions were sharply divided. Some praised Danielle for standing her ground and using her platform to call out racism within law enforcement. They admired her poise, her professionalism, and her commitment to justice. But others had a much more dismissive response. Some suggested that perhaps the officer was just doing his job, that there was no reason to blow things out of proportion. To these individuals, the issue of racial profiling seemed like an isolated problem, one that wasn't truly systemic. Danielle was prepared for this. She had seen firsthand how issues of race were too often brushed aside or downplayed, how deeply ingrained biases influenced everyday interactions. But what she couldn't ignore were the stories that started flooding in from others. People, particularly people of color, began sharing their own experiences with law enforcement. Stories poured in from across the country, each one reflecting a similar pattern of disrespect, unfair treatment, and sometimes outright violence. It became clear to Danielle that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Her story had struck a chord. It wasn't just about the officer or her personal experience. It was about the larger problem of racial profiling, discriminatory policing, and the unchecked abuse of power that too often went unnoticed. Her complaint became the spark in a much-needed national conversation about police reform. Within hours, the story was being discussed in city councils, local forums, and even at the national level. Politicians weighed in, some calling for swift accountability, others defending the need for officers to have discretion in the field. The debate was polarized, with strong opinions on both sides. But Danielle remained firm in her stance. Accountability and education needed to be at the forefront of any reform efforts. At the same time, Danielle knew that the spotlight on her and the officer wasn't the end of the matter. This was going to have long-term consequences. The FBI, of course, was not blind to the situation. They took her complaint seriously, but she could tell that there was more at stake than just a departmental review. Her boss, Special Agent Chief Aidan Reynolds, was supportive of her actions, but he also knew that the FBI was often at the heart of these types of investigations. They were often the ones conducting oversight on local law enforcement agencies. The pressure was mounting, and Danielle knew that this would eventually involve higher-ups at the federal level as well. Days after filing the complaint, Danielle was called into a meeting with her supervisors. As she sat across from them in the sterile, minimalist conference room, they discussed the implications of what had occurred. They weren't just concerned with the local police officer. They were looking at this through a much broader lens. Was this officer just a rogue bad apple, or was his behavior indicative of something more deeply entrenched in law enforcement? The truth was that while one officer could be investigated and retrained, the problem went beyond just one individual. This was a systemic issue that required deeper scrutiny. Danielle had always known that her job as an FBI agent involved confronting difficult truths. But now, more than ever, it felt like the weight of that responsibility was on her shoulders. She was already a key player in one of the most challenging cases of her career, tracking down a criminal syndicate that had its fingers in everything from human trafficking to money laundering. But now, her personal experience had given her a front-row seat to another kind of injustice, the kind that affected people at their core, breaking down their trust in the very system meant to protect them. Meanwhile, the officer who had accosted her was facing mounting pressure. An internal review board had been established, tasked with investigating his conduct. He was put on administrative leave while the department looked into the incident. The initial reaction was one of denial. Some within the department had attempted to justify the officer's actions, claiming that he was just doing his job. But as more people spoke out and more evidence came to light, it became clear that his actions went far beyond the scope of duty. Danielle knew that the officer would likely face consequences, but she was not about to rest until accountability was achieved. This wasn't just about the man who had stopped her in the middle of the night. It was about all the individuals whose lives had been marred by similar encounters. It was about showing the world that this kind of treatment would no longer be tolerated. While the officer's future hung in the balance, Danielle's own future began to take on a new shape. The media buzz was relentless, and she quickly found herself as the face of this larger conversation about racial injustice and the need for systemic reform. She received letters of support from people she had never met, and even law enforcement officials from other states reached out to express their gratitude for her courage. But there was also a backlash. Some communities felt that the officer had been unfairly targeted, and some of the more vocal detractors questioned Danielle's role in all of this. They believed that the issue of race was being blown out of proportion, and that this was just another case of playing the race card. But these voices were beginning to be drowned out by the overwhelming support for change. Danielle knew that her actions had made a difference, even if not everyone could see it yet. As the internal review process continued, Danielle decided to take her advocacy further. She began meeting with local activists and community leaders, learning more about the efforts being made in various cities to combat police misconduct. She knew that reform had to come from within the system, but it had to be led by people who understood the needs of the communities they served. Danielle wasn't interested in simply raising awareness. She was focused on creating tangible change, ensuring that no one else would have to endure the kind of treatment she had faced. The fallout from the incident would have ripple effects across the country, and while Danielle knew that she couldn't change the system overnight, she also knew that this moment, This confrontation with injustice was the beginning of something much larger. This was her fight now, and she was going to see it through to the end. A nation reacts. The impact of courage. As Danielle Carter continued to process the aftermath of her confrontation with the police officer, the public reaction to her bravery only continued to grow. The story had rapidly gained momentum, becoming an undeniable spark in the nationwide conversation about racism and police misconduct. What had begun as a private, unsettling incident had evolved into something that would define not just her career, but also the course of her life. For the first time, Danielle found herself at the center of a powerful movement, one that she had never anticipated but felt compelled to lead. The media coverage was relentless. News outlets all over the country began picking up her story, and it wasn't long before her image and her voice became synonymous with the fight for justice. The raw, unfiltered footage of her calmly confronting the officer had captivated viewers. They saw in her poise, her confidence, and her resolute refusal to be silenced a powerful message of resilience and dignity. Danielle had taken an insult, a blatant violation of her rights, and turned it into a symbol of hope, not just for herself, but for all the countless others who had suffered similar treatment in silence. While many across the nation cheered her on, the response was not without its critics. A vocal minority of people, particularly those who had never experienced racial profiling themselves, began to question the legitimacy of her claims. Some argued that she was exaggerating or misinterpreting the situation, claiming that the officer was simply doing his job. To them, the accusation of racism was just another divisive issue. But these voices only seemed to underscore the importance of the conversation Danielle had started. The fact that there was resistance to confronting the uncomfortable reality of racial inequality was, in itself, proof that the work was far from over. Despite the pushback, a groundswell of support began to take root in various communities, particularly in areas that had been the most affected by police overreach. Protesters took to the streets, chanting for justice and demanding reform in local police departments. These weren't just isolated groups. They were communities of people who had felt the sting of racial profiling, who had experienced firsthand the discrimination that Danielle's story had illuminated. People of all races came together, unified by the need for change. The protests, while peaceful, carried an undeniable urgency, a call to action that couldn't be ignored. Danielle watched as the story gained traction, and the voices of the people who had shared their own encounters with police brutality and racial profiling grew louder. It was one thing to experience this sort of injustice firsthand, but to see the widespread nature of the problem, to hear the heart-wrenching stories from so many others, it was overwhelming. And yet, it was also affirming. She wasn't alone. Her actions had triggered a national conversation, one that was long overdue. Politicians, community leaders, and law enforcement officials were now forced to address the issues head-on. Some politicians took to social media and public forums, offering their support for Danielle and calling for stronger accountability measures in police departments. Activists seized the moment to push for new policies, ones that would ensure racial profiling was addressed, and that officers who engaged in such behavior faced the consequences. Some law enforcement representatives, realizing the weight of the issue, began to acknowledge the need for systemic change. But others were reluctant, unwilling to acknowledge the depth of the problem within their own ranks. As the public discussion expanded, a new layer of complexity emerged: the question of the officer's future. Danielle's encounter with him had been the catalyst for this national conversation, but the question of what should happen to him next became a flashpoint in the debate. Would he be fired, as some demanded, or would he be given the chance to retrain and reform his views? The debate about the officer's fate wasn't just about one man. It symbolized a broader dilemma facing the nation. What was the appropriate way to deal with law enforcement officers who engaged in racist or discriminatory behavior? Was accountability best served by firing them, or could education and reform lead to a meaningful change in their attitudes? At the heart of this debate was the realization that the system needed to change, not just the individuals within it. This officer's actions had become a symbol of a larger issue that needed to be addressed with urgency. Danielle had made that clear in her public statements. Racism has no place in our society, especially in institutions meant to protect and serve, she declared in a televised interview. But accountability is essential, as is education. It is time we build a system that respects and values every individual, regardless of their race or background. Her words resonated deeply, stirring emotions across the country. The divide between those who supported her and those who believed she was overreacting was vast, but her clarity of purpose was undeniable. Danielle wasn't just talking about her personal experience. She was speaking on behalf of all those who had suffered from unjust treatment, those who had been targeted, disrespected, and dehumanized by individuals in positions of power. The officer in question, still on administrative leave, found himself in the midst of an internal investigation. A review board was assembled, and while many people argued that he should be fired immediately, others within the police force wanted to give him a chance to learn and grow. Retraining, some believed, could lead to an opportunity for genuine change. But as the process dragged on, Danielle knew that the decision made here would set a precedent for how police departments across the country would address such issues in the future. The internal investigation dragged on for weeks, but the public's focus remained unwavering. Every new development in the case made headlines, and every new revelation only seemed to reinforce the need for comprehensive reform. Danielle's voice, in the meantime, continued to rise, as she became not only a symbol of individual courage, but also a voice for justice on a national scale. Her story had captured the attention of many, but what truly moved Danielle was the outpouring of support from the communities most affected by racial profiling and discrimination. People sent her letters, emails, and messages of thanks, telling her how her courage had inspired them to take a stand in their own lives. These messages came from all walks of life, from everyday citizens who had endured mistreatment to law enforcement officers who recognized the need for change within their own ranks. Danielle found herself at the center of a movement that, despite its obstacles and divisions, was beginning to shape the course of history. The national debate was not limited to protests and online discussions. It had moved into policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Politicians began to propose new legislation aimed at reforming law enforcement, with a focus on reducing racial profiling, increasing transparency, and creating stronger oversight mechanisms. Danielle's story had become a rallying point for lawmakers who had previously hesitated to confront the racial disparities within the justice system. Despite the overwhelming support for reform, Danielle knew that change would take time. The road ahead would be long, and the fight against systemic racism would not be won overnight. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. There was a sense that the conversation started by her actions, by the courageous stand she had taken against a system that had wronged her, were finally starting to make a real difference. The ripple effects of her decision to stand up had reached far beyond that single night in the street. It was a movement that was beginning to change the very fabric of the nation. Danielle had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. Her courage had become the catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for the countless others who had been overlooked and oppressed for far too long. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about reshaping the system that had allowed such behavior to persist for so long. The nation was listening now. Change was on the horizon. The officer's choice, accountability, and redemption. The pressure surrounding the police officer's fate intensified as the days passed. For the first time in his career, Officer Darren Blake found himself at the center of a storm, a spotlight on his every action and decision. What had started as a routine stop, one that he likely never imagined would escalate so drastically, had turned into a defining moment in his life. He had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review, and the department had already begun the process of examining his conduct in detail. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct, his unjust treatment of Danielle Carter, his blatant racial profiling, and his failure to follow protocol, the question of what to do next wasn't a simple one. His actions had caused irreparable damage to his reputation, but also to the relationship between law enforcement and the very community he was meant to protect. For many, this was about much more than just one officer. It was about an institution that had, time and again, failed to address systemic racism, whether consciously or unconsciously. Officer Blake had been a member of the force for over a decade, a veteran who had risen through the ranks with a reputation for getting the job done. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that his history, his prior actions, were irrelevant in the face of what he had done on that fateful night. He had been blinded by his biases, allowed his prejudices to cloud his judgment, and as a result, he had humiliated an innocent woman without cause. The officer's future hung in the balance, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the painful reality of his behavior. In his private moments, Blake was consumed by guilt. He could not shake the image of Danielle's calm demeanor as she had pulled out her badge and exposed his grave mistake. His mind replayed the moment over and over again, the look on her face as she calmly but firmly informed him of who she was. He realized then how deeply his actions had been influenced by his own biases, and he could not escape the haunting truth that he had violated not just a citizen's rights, but the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold when he joined the force. Blake had never considered himself to be racist. He had always told himself that he treated everyone the same, that his job was about enforcing the law, not about making assumptions based on someone's appearance. But in the wake of the incident with Danielle, the harsh reality hit him. His actions had been driven by something deeper, something that he had not wanted to acknowledge, something that was ingrained within him from years of unchallenged beliefs. He had acted out of fear, out of suspicion, and out of a deep-rooted belief that someone like Danielle, a black woman driving a luxury car, didn't belong in that role. The internal review process moved forward, and Blake found himself summoned to appear before a panel of his peers, senior officers and civilian representatives. The investigation into his actions was thorough, with every detail scrutinized. His treatment of Danielle, his failure to provide a valid explanation for the stop, his aggressive behavior, and his unjustified accusations of grand theft auto. He could no longer deny the magnitude of his mistake. The evidence against him was undeniable, and the department could not ignore the profound damage his actions had caused to public trust. Blake's superiors, knowing the gravity of the situation, gave him two choices. He could resign from his position, walking away from the force, or he could face extensive retraining on racial bias, policing ethics, and community relations, with the possibility of returning to active duty. The decision was a difficult one. The option of resignation seemed like an easy way out, a chance to avoid the consequences of his actions and walk away from the profession that had been his life. But deep down, Blake knew that choosing the path of resignation would be an admission that he was unwilling to confront the problem he had caused, an unwillingness to change. On the other hand, retraining seemed like an arduous process. It would force him to face his own flaws and biases head-on, to challenge everything he had thought he knew about policing and about himself. It was a chance for redemption, but only if he was willing to put in the hard work necessary to truly change. He knew it would not be an easy road. The path to reconciliation would be filled with difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and the realization that his career and his life could never be the same again. The officer's choice, accountability, and redemption. The pressure surrounding the police officer's fate intensified as the days passed. For the first time in his career, Officer Darren Blake found himself at the center of a storm, a spotlight on his every action and decision. What had started as a routine stop, one that he likely never imagined would escalate so drastically, had turned into a defining moment in his life. He had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review, and the department had already begun the process of examining his conduct in detail. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct, his unjust treatment of Danielle Carter, his blatant racial profiling, and his failure to follow protocol, the question of what to do next wasn't a simple one. His actions had caused irreparable damage to his reputation, but also to the relationship between law enforcement and the very community he was meant to protect. For many, this was about much more than just one officer. It was about an institution that had, time and again, failed to address systemic racism, whether consciously or unconsciously. Officer Blake had been a member of the force for over a decade, a veteran who had risen through the ranks with a reputation for getting the job done. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that his history, his prior actions, were irrelevant in the face of what he had done on that fateful night. He had been blinded by his biases, allowed his prejudices to cloud his judgment, and as a result, he had humiliated an innocent woman without cause. The officer's future hung in the balance, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the painful reality of his behavior. In his private moments, Blake was consumed by guilt. He could not shake the image of Danielle's calm demeanor as she had pulled out her badge and exposed his grave mistake. His mind replayed the moment over and over again, the look on her face as she calmly but firmly informed him of who she was. He realized then how deeply his actions had been influenced by his own biases, and he could not escape the haunting truth that he had violated not just a citizen's rights, but the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold when he joined the force. Blake had never considered himself to be racist. He had always told himself that he treated everyone the same, that his job was about enforcing the law, not about making assumptions based on someone's appearance. But in the wake of the incident with Danielle, the harsh reality hit him. His actions had been driven by something deeper, something that he had not wanted to acknowledge, something that was ingrained within him from years of unchallenged beliefs. He had acted out of fear, out of suspicion, and out of a deep-rooted belief that someone like Danielle, a black woman driving a luxury car, didn't belong in that role. The internal review process moved forward, and Blake found himself summoned to appear before a panel of his peers, senior officers, and civilian representatives. The investigation into his actions was thorough, with every detail scrutinized: his treatment of Danielle, his failure to provide a valid explanation for the stop, his aggressive behavior, and his unjustified accusations of grand theft auto. He could no longer deny the magnitude of his mistake. The evidence against him was undeniable, and the department could not ignore the profound damage his actions had caused to public trust. Blake's superiors, knowing the gravity of the situation, gave him two choices. He could resign from his position, walking away from the force, or he could face extensive retraining on racial bias, policing ethics, and community relations, with the possibility of returning to active duty. The decision was a difficult one. The option of resignation seemed like an easy way out, a chance to avoid the consequences of his actions and walk away from the profession that had been his life. But deep down, Blake knew that choosing the path of resignation would be an admission that he was unwilling to confront the problem he had caused, an unwillingness to change. On the other hand, retraining seemed like an arduous process. It would force him to face his own flaws and biases head-on, to challenge everything he had thought he knew about policing and about himself. It was a chance for redemption, but only if he was willing to put in the hard work necessary to truly change. He knew it would not be an easy road. The path to reconciliation would be filled with difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and the realization that his career and his life could never be the same again. The ripple effect, the long path to systemic change. As the weeks and months passed, the ripple effects of the incident involving Officer Darren Blake and Agent Danielle Carter spread far beyond the streets where the confrontation had taken place. What had started as a singular moment of injustice had evolved into a national movement, one that challenged deeply entrenched attitudes and forced the country to confront the ugly realities of racial profiling, police misconduct, and the systemic inequities embedded in the justice system. Danielle's actions had set off a chain reaction, a spark that ignited a firestorm of debate, protest, and most importantly, reform. The decision of Officer Blake to undergo retraining had been just one part of this larger shift, but it symbolized something much deeper: the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, to confront the biases that had shaped law enforcement practices for generations, and to take responsibility for the harm done. While Blake's retraining was seen as a positive step by some, others remained deeply skeptical. The public reaction was split. For many, the decision to give the officer a second chance at redemption was viewed as a necessary step in building a more accountable, fair system. They believed that the only way to achieve meaningful reform was to engage with officers, to provide opportunities for growth and education, and to offer them the chance to change their behavior. This was not about allowing an officer to escape the consequences of his actions. It was about giving him the tools to understand the profound impact his biases had on the people he was meant to protect. However, there were others who felt that retraining was not enough. They argued that systemic change was required, and that the officer's behavior was only a symptom of a much larger problem. These individuals called for more drastic measures, such as an overhaul of police training programs, more transparent oversight of law enforcement agencies, and the defunding or restructuring of departments that had failed to adequately address issues of racism and abuse of power. The growing movement to reimagine policing gained momentum, with activists and community leaders calling for a fundamental shift in the way law enforcement engaged with the public, especially communities of color. Danielle had expected some of the backlash. As a seasoned FBI agent, she knew that when it came to confronting difficult truths, the road would never be easy. But the outpouring of support, especially from the communities most affected by racial discrimination, reaffirmed her belief that change was possible. The voices of those who had been victimized by police brutality and racial profiling had never been louder, and their stories were now being heard. In the weeks following the public revelation of Officer Blake's retraining decision, several other police departments around the country announced that they would be implementing similar programs aimed at reducing racial bias and improving relations between officers and the communities they served. Danielle's story had become a blueprint for other cities grappling with the same issues, and law enforcement agencies across the nation began to reevaluate their own policies and practices. The issue of racial profiling and police brutality was no longer a fringe topic. It had become part of the national conversation. News outlets, social media platforms, and politicians now had no choice but to engage with the issue head-on. The national attention on law enforcement's failure to protect and serve all citizens equally forced lawmakers to introduce legislation aimed at reforming police practices, including more comprehensive anti-bias training, increased civilian oversight, and policies that would hold officers accountable for misconduct. This legislative push gained traction in several states, and discussions around police funding were revisited, with some cities taking action to reinvest in community-based alternatives to traditional policing. The momentum for reform wasn't just limited to public policy, it extended to corporate America, educational institutions, and even the entertainment industry. Companies began to evaluate their diversity and inclusion policies, recognizing that issues of racism and discrimination were not limited to the police force, but affected nearly every institution in society. Universities and schools began to offer programs designed to educate students on the history of systemic racism and how to identify and combat it in their own lives. Media outlets shifted their focus to amplify the voices of marginalized communities, and filmmakers, artists, and musicians used their platforms to bring attention to the inequities that persisted in every corner of American life. In the midst of all this, Danielle continued her work, but her role in the broader movement was growing. As an FBI agent, her primary focus had always been on the job at hand, the cases she was assigned to, the criminals she was chasing. But now, her life had become intertwined with the larger conversation on police reform and racial justice. Danielle was approached by activists, journalists, and even lawmakers who wanted her input on how to move forward. Her story had resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, and she quickly became an unofficial spokesperson for the movement for justice and accountability within law enforcement. Despite her newfound visibility, Danielle remained grounded in the same principles that had driven her to file her complaint in the first place. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition. She was seeking real, lasting change. She knew that the public's attention would eventually shift, that the media's focus would move on to the next big story. But she also knew that the work of reforming the justice system would continue long after the cameras were gone. The true test of change wouldn't be in the headlines. It would be in the policies enacted, the behavior of law enforcement, and most importantly, the everyday experiences of marginalized communities. As Danielle continued to advocate for justice, she found herself involved in more discussions with law enforcement leaders. She wasn't just challenging the status quo. She was actively participating in shaping the future of policing. One of the most difficult conversations she had was with a group of senior officers who had served in law enforcement for decades. These individuals were often set in their ways, resistant to change, and unwilling to admit that the very foundation of their training might be flawed. But Danielle's approach was firm yet empathetic. She didn't accuse them of being inherently racist. She challenged them to look at the broader system they were a part of, to question the biases that influenced their actions, and to consider how they could do better for the people they served. The conversations were uncomfortable, often tense, but they were necessary. Danielle knew that true change would only come when law enforcement officers at every level were willing to engage in difficult self-reflection. Change had to start from within the department, but it had to be driven by the people who were at the front lines of policing. At the same time, Danielle's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at conferences, to address large groups of law enforcement officials, and to participate in roundtable discussions on the future of policing. She shared her personal experiences, not just as an FBI agent, but as a Black woman who had witnessed firsthand the failures of the justice system. She talked about her own struggles, her own pain, and how it had shaped her views on what needed to change. Danielle's voice was a powerful reminder that the fight for justice was not just theoretical, it was personal, it was urgent, and it was long overdue. Yet, even as her influence expanded, Danielle remained focused on the work that still needed to be done. She continued her undercover operations, working tirelessly to bring criminals to justice. But in the background, she was also pushing for systemic reform, leveraging her position to advocate for change, both within the FBI and the broader law enforcement community. Her dual roles, both as an agent and as a leading voice for reform, became central to her identity. As more police departments adopted the policies she had advocated for, as more officers went through retraining programs, and as more cities took a closer look at the disparities in their justice systems, Danielle began to see a shift. It was slow, but it was there. The conversations were becoming more honest, the work more focused, and the goal more achievable. Police departments were beginning to understand that reform was not just a reaction to public outcry. It was a necessary evolution, one that would ultimately make their communities safer and more just. The story of Danielle and Officer Blake was no longer just a singular event. It had become a cornerstone of a larger narrative. A narrative of change, of accountability, and of hope. It was a reminder that every small action, every brave step, could lead to something larger than any one individual's effort. Danielle knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but she also knew that real change had begun. The world had taken notice, and the wheels of progress were turning. Together, with the support of countless others, she was committed to seeing it through, knowing that every step forward was another victory in the ongoing battle for equality and fairness.